Senator Robert Dole, but for a few thousand votes cast differently in Ohio and in Hawaii, would now be the Vice President of the United States in the Ford administration, and Jimmy Carter would be back in Georgia as the rejected and therefore discredited outsider. Americans tend to extend limited hospitality to losers, and accordingly there has been a considerable literature devoted to the finding that Senator Dole cost the Republicans the presidency. That's one way of looking at it. The other is that when President Ford selected Mr. Dole, Ford was running behind Carter by 30 points. He ended by losing by less than 1 point. But we intend to discuss the future of the Republican Party and the broader question of why a party that can score almost 50% for a Republican president is reduced nationwide to 12 governorships, 5 state legislatures, 38 and 143 votes respectively in the Senate and the House. Robert J. Dole was born and educated in Kansas, receiving his law degree from the Washburn University of Topeka. Before that, he had fought in the war, almost getting killed in the European theater and earning a number of decorations for bravery. He returned to practice law and to begin his political career. Until his race for the vice presidency, he never lost a political contest, running for the legislature in Kansas, then the House of Representatives, and finally the United States Senate. In 1971, he was selected by President Nixon as chairman of the Republican National Committee, in which role he served for 2 years. It was on that occasion that he said about himself, "If you like Richard Nixon, you love Bob Dole." I'd like to begin by asking Senator Dole whether, in his opinion, there is a good case to be made for changing the name of the Republican Party.
I don't think there's a good case to be made right now for changing the name of the Republican Party under the campaign finance laws now. I think that presents one obstacle, and I'm not so certain that changing the name is going to change a great deal in any event. It may sound like an easy solution just to call us something else and more people will be attracted to our party. I'd like to think that we can get out and do some basic work around this country and strengthen our party in the grassroots, get away from the top-down business we've had in our party for a number of years and start working from the bottom up.
Well, but undoubtedly that's a position that you have had ever since you were chairman of the party. And since then, the party has really seen its almost lowest ebb. Now, is that purely a Watergate catastrophe, or does it have to do with a trend that you anticipated in 1971 for the whole party?
Well, I'm not certain I anticipated, but I think we thought we had a great opportunity in '72 to really broaden the base of our party. But unfortunately, those who really ran the election that year were so preoccupied with the re-election of President Nixon that we really had made very little effort in state and local races, and the results, again, we were just sort of rocking along. And then along came Watergate, which was devastating in courthouses and state houses and congressional races. But again, I'm not certain that we changed the party's name. I find some little support for that, maybe in the South and other areas where they feel that another name would attract more people. But it's not the name that needs to be changed. Perhaps it's the direction, and I don't mean leftward, but I mean a direction as far as getting back to basic politics, grassroots politics, finding good candidates, trying to appeal to blacks and Hispanics and others in America to join our party and identify themselves and run as Republicans. So I would say the change in the name would not have much of an impact, in my view.
Well, is there a case, a symbolic case to be made for a party that has attempted to assimilate a great scandal and great reverses, deciding that the only way it can sort of publicly expiate is by going out of formal existence, even if it reorganizes the same day with the same people, under a different banner? It is true, isn't it, that the South ought to be voting Republican if it had performed as one might have expected it to perform, given the conventional preferences of the people who live and vote there. The election of a few months ago would have gone very differently. Now, if you as a practical man were persuaded that a party under another name would have achieved different results, would you, out of sentimentality to the old name, resist the change?
Oh, no. If I had some evidence that by keeping our principles but changing the name, we could be a greater force in American politics, and I'm very reasonable. I would accept that. But I look at the South last November, and in my view, voters voted their accent, not their philosophy in many cases. And I think this is behind us now, and perhaps depending on what President Carter does in the next 2 to 4 years, we'll see a different result. We were clinging to the hope up until the last that at least Mississippi and Louisiana would be in the Ford column. We lost by narrow margins, but it seemed to me that we had the right philosophy. It wasn't the name that kept us from carrying the South. It was the fact that we had a Southerner on the ticket, and he had a commanding lead, which we whittled away, and but it was still enough to carry all but one Southern state, Fort Carter.
Well, but haven't you found it difficult during the last 8 or 10 years, especially during the period when you were national chairman, to encourage a substructure of republicanism in the South as a result of a continuing bias against the name? I mean, well, it's one thing when you elect Strom Thurmond or
right.
when you elect Eisenhower or something like that, but when you get around to the local legislators, there isn't a chance, is there?
But we were, in my view, we're really on the move in the South in '69 and '70 and '71 and then in '72 even, and then we blew it with Watergate. You look at bright young Republicans, Howard Baker and Bill Brock and others in the South, Jim Broyle in North Carolina. We're making great gains in the South with running as Republicans because of our philosophy. And then I think perhaps the Watergate set us back a decade or more, and we've got to start over. Now, you layer on top of Watergate the fact that we now have a Southern president, and it's going to make it very difficult, and we sustained great losses in the South. But I'm not, I believe that in the South our party organization may be as strong in some states as it is in the Midwest or the West. And so I get back to my premise that we will not be a strong second party until we really get back to organization and precinct operation, and again finding good candidates. And I don't mean liberal candidates, they're not, I mean good candidates who will work in the Republican Party.
Well, speaking of working within the Republican Party, to what extent do you think that it is immobilized by the continuing tension between its two wings? You get some people in the Republican Party who will vote rather consistently with the Democrats and who will oppose, for instance, a Ronald Reagan, preferring to think of him as an outsider, unrepresentative of the party. Is it your opinion that there is a fissure there which is best handled by terminating, by euthanasia of the Republican Party to be replaced by another party which encourages, as you say, blacks and Hispanics and others who have traditionally been taught to think of the Republican Party as a big business party?
Well, again, I don't believe there's a fissure that we can't broach somehow. It seems to me that you know, when you lose an election, everybody has their own laundry list of what happened and why we lost, why Ford lost, and the liberals lash out at the conservatives in our party, and the conservatives lash out at the liberals, and the net result is we're still a small group, and every time we regroup, we lose a few. And we're down to about 18% now in America who identify themselves as Republicans. But I don't, I think I consider myself to be a conservative, but I think we have to be, if we're going to be a strong, broad-based party, we have to accommodate the views of Senator Mathias from Maryland and Senator Brooke from Massachusetts and Ronald Reagan from California and Jesse Helms from North Carolina. That doesn't mean we have to agree, but I just don't believe we can take a litmus test in our party. I don't think we can have an entrance examination. We can't afford that luxury, and I don't really believe we're going to be a strong party by purging any one wing of the party or suggesting that they're not welcome in the party.
Well, theoretically, anybody who votes for you is welcome.
It's true.
We
almost had enough.
As a practical matter. But it is true, isn't it, that the existence, let's use Senator Mathias as an example, that his highly disclosed displeasure with most Republican policies has the effect of persuading a great many voters that Senator Mathias and a few other senators are sort of holding the bridge against the fanatics who would otherwise leave the party completely ideologized. Now, the leverage that the Mathiases have in the Republican Party is enough to greatly affect its national image, isn't it?
Well, I'm not certain it is, whether it's the Mathiases or whether it's the other end of the spectrum. I really believe we focus too much attention on what happens in the Senate with Republicans or what happens in the House of Representatives in Washington. And I think we've always had this focus of late on a few party leaders and not enough attention paid, again, to precinct politics. And it seems to me that when I go back to Kansas, or when I go to Colorado, when I go to California, I'm not certain how many in that Republican audience know anything about Senator Mathias or Senator Bob Dole or anyone else for that matter. They're Republicans because they're interested in the party on the state or the local level. They may know about Ronald Reagan, they may know about Gerald Ford, but I think we waste a great deal of our time posturizing and moralizing and agonizing about a certain Republican who may be on the right or on the left or someone who may consider himself to be in the middle. And I just believe that instead we could better spend our time out knocking on doors trying to find someone in a black area that went 412 to 6 for Carter to say that, well, I would be a Republican if this were the case. And I don't think we can ever be a strong party if we're going to divide up on a personality basis. And I hope that's behind us now, probably not.
Well, it may very well be that the Senator Mathiases don't have an important hold on public thought, but they do have a very important hold in internal Republican politics. In fact, they dominated Republican politics up until fairly recently, wouldn't you say? Now, that being the case, is it possible that their continuing influence within the Republican organization prevents it from being the vehicle for a truly successful national conservative politician?
Well, if we're looking at the Republican Party as truly a conservative party, that may be true. Mm-hmm. I mean, if we're going to say anyone who crosses a certain line is no longer welcome in our party as a party leader, then I assume we could eliminate some on both sides. But again, we look at our party, and we find problems. We look at the other party, and they win, so suddenly there are no problems. As I recall, and I want to focus on the last campaign, but the very day that Carter was being endorsed by the Liberal Party in New York, I believe, or in the same time frame, he was being trotted around Mississippi by Senator Eastland and Senator Stennis. Mm-hmm. Now, that's a real balancing act, and they put it together, and they're all Democrats, and they are proud to be aligned with the President Carter, or candidate Carter at the time. We don't seem to be able to do that. We sort of carry over after the campaign, and we find ourselves in Reagan groups or Ford groups or some other group. So I'm not willing to suggest that we start giving anyone their walking papers in our party. I think we need a different emphasis.
Well, what would you say that Carter has done or will predictably do, such as to justify the enthusiasm shown for him by Senator Eastland and Senator Stennis? What's the quid pro quo?
Well, I couldn't really come up with anything at the time. I mean, I looked at his close ties to labor, his willingness to sign repeal of right-to-work laws, Section 14B, his stand on sidist picketing. I really couldn't see any reason other than they were Democrats and they were supporting the nominee. That's always the out for Democrats. They say, well, I'm supporting the nominee, while Republicans, they support the platform or they support this. And it's going to be difficult, I believe, for Carter to to satisfy, I wouldn't say both wings, there are more wings than that in their party in the next 2 to 3 years. And perhaps when that, there may be some fracturing or falling apart of some of the Democrat allegiance. But they have, as you know, they're able to stick together despite the difficulties and despite the differences. And so Carter is now in the White House, and I don't, a few more votes, as you've indicated, would have made it a different result, but we'll see what happens now with the president.
Well, you mentioned that the principal attraction of Carter in the South was his accent and the fact that he was a homeboy, and I can understand that. But doesn't this make it more difficult to understand how much closer Ford came to re-election than the typical Republican senator and congressman and governor who did so poorly, relatively speaking? If Carter's advantages were unique to himself, how do you account for the disadvantages of those people who weren't running against a Southerner, but people who were running against other people in all those states in which we did so poorly?
That's right, but in a great many states, as you know, Carter ran well behind the ticket in many states. Carter and Ford ran well ahead. In congressional districts, I think the total vote count was 8 or 9 million ahead. If you add up all the districts and how Ford ran well ahead because of picking up a great percentage of the independent vote. But I can't account for the final result. It just seems to me that we look at the black vote. We can't, as a Republican Party or a party by any name, give to the other party 90 or 95% of that segment of the vote and be a strong second party. And in the South, in some areas, it was 40 to 50 to 1 for Carter. President Ford has expressed his keen disappointment because he had a good record. And I think he was progressive in the right way as far as black Americans were concerned. And he was concerned about many of their concerns, and I think it acted very responsibly. But we have a Southerner on the ticket. I say accent, I say the fact that he was a neighbor, but they were able to put it together, just barely put it together. I think labor probably played the biggest role, but and that's another fact of life. Here we are with 12 governorships. We control only 5 legislatures. Every big city mayor, with 1 or 2 exceptions, are Democrats. We're outnumbered nearly 2 to 1 in the Congress, and I don't think we change our strength by changing our name.
Well, what would the Republican Party say, for instance, to black Americans in areas in which, you know, they had voted 98%, 95%? What would you, campaigning there, say to them that you think would distinctly suggest to them the advantages of voting Republican?
Well, I happen to believe, and there are areas where we've gotten as high as 40, 50% in some areas of the black vote. I believe their concerns are very much like most other Americans.
Well,
they're
I
concerned
do too.
About taxes.
But they
they're
don't think
concerned
so.
About defense.
Crime.
But we didn't say anything. We didn't said hardly anything in the campaign. I think the total budget in the predominantly black areas was less than $300,000. And you look at that compared to the efforts made by the Democrats. It was a pitiful effort made by the Republican Party in the presidential race. And it just seems to me that, and I'm not suggesting we're going to walk out and by saying something or advocating something, suddenly find ourselves with 30 or 40% nationwide of black voters. We ought to have 10 or 15. And had we had the 10 or 15 that we normally have, President Ford would have been elected. And,
well, could it be that a public ignorance is outpacing public understanding of the essential elements of the political economy, that so many people now have said to the voters under so many circumstances that they can get free this, free that, free the other, without any compensating sacrifices at another level, that the Republicans have an almost insuperable intellectual task to perform, which they're not going to be able to perform, with the result that, especially as we move towards universal registration,
yes.
and all those other vote democratic measures, the result will be a sort of a Mexicanization of American politics, with the Democrats simply having huge majorities election after election? Or do you not view this as likely?
Well, I view it as likely if we pass every measure that the President Carter has suggested to be electoral reform. It seems significant to me that he would zero in on this before we get into the energy crisis and the economy. The first thing, and the Democrats are very good at this, first thing they're concerned about is the next election. So the first package we have in the Congress of any substance is what they call electoral reform. But again, I suggest that if we work at it properly, you know, when the Black Caucus meets and condemns President Ford, as it did almost weekly, there's not a Republican member of that Black Caucus. Now, we have to find some spokesmen in the House of Representatives, Black Americans and Hispanics and others who believe in a philosophy that talks about not welfare, but talks about inflation and defense and limited government. And I think there are a great many Black Americans who are concerned about that. Now, I don't know that we can ever match, and I hope we can never match some of the liberal Democrats on giveaway programs, but I think we are perceived as a party of being beginners, that somehow we're anti-people, that we're not concerned about the poor. And that's not the case, but it's the way it comes off. I remember being asked in the campaign, why doesn't President Ford say something positive, or why don't you say something positive? Well, I thought we were saying something positive, and so did many Americans, but it's a good question that the media raise from time to time.
Well, if I understand you, you are really suggesting that we have intellectual and rhetorical obstacles that are very, very difficult to overcome. Now, does this lead you to the conclusion that those who are opposed to big government and those who are opposed to the socialization of life and of the private sector are doomed to fail in any protracted discourse in a democratic society?
Oh, I don't believe so. But I also believe, and I said as much and will continue to, that those who believe in the private sector and the free enterprise system better start doing something about it. I find many businessmen giving lip service to the free enterprise system and the private sector and all it stands for. We did a little survey was done after the election in political action committees and so-called fat cat groups and special interests. And the study reveals that 65% of their money for campaigns went to Democrats. So where are these statesmen in business and other groups who are really concerned about the free enterprise system? Are they willing to stand and fight with those of us who have moderate to conservative views? Some are and some are not. And there's another factor, without going back, but in the South we had the problem with, in agricultural areas, voted heavily for Carter throughout the South because of their views as Carter's a farmer and one of their own in the White House. Now, since that time, there may have been a change, but it just seems to me that as a Republican Party, we have to recognize that we're in a very weakened position. We've got to start doing some of the things we haven't done for years, and that's organization, finding attractive candidates from the standpoint of those willing to work and go out and try to rev up the party in some way, and then go after it. We've got to stop being this top-down party that fields a ticket every 4 years and does pretty well in the presidential race while the rest of our base is eroding.
As an example of the kind of difficulty that you have faced and will face, assuming that you were addressing a group of, say you were addressing a group of Hispanic Americans in San Antonio, and somebody asks you the question, Senator Dole, why do you oppose the registration reform suggested by President Carter? How would you handle their suspicions that you really wanted fewer of them to vote?
Well, I don't know how I can handle, I probably can't handle their suspicions, but I can also...
Well, you can reassure them, can't you? Or can you?
I can reassure them. I can point up the very reason for registration in the first place was to stop the abuse and stop the fraud, and now we've come full cycle, and now we're back to saying, well, you ought to be able to walk in and walk off the street and and vote in this precinct and maybe vote somewhere else. I don't know. But it seems to me we have to provide some safeguards and again, in the recent surveys, the post-election surveys showing that had those who didn't vote and who were not eligible to vote voted, Carter would have won by 17 percentage points instead of less than 2. So it doesn't take any genius to determine what Carter has in mind, and that's 8 years in the White House. We don't have that in mind. But
well, so suppose the man to whom you addressed those remarks had two things. Number one, in Minnesota and in Wisconsin, where they have this registration law, there have been practically no allegations of fraud. And
well, in Wisconsin, this past election, that was one of the areas where there was some thought, not by President Ford, but by some Republican leaders who thought we should have gone to court because there were 70,000 people walked off the street and voted who weren't previously registered, or some figure of that kind. And the result was we lost the state. Now, whether we'd have lost it in any event, I don't know. Minnesota is nearly a very strong Democrat farm labor state. They have no registration requirements there.
Well, suppose he said, okay, I'll go along with you, Senator, in believing that there is an ulterior motive by Mr. Carter. He really wants more Democrats to vote. But I think you have an ulterior motive. I think you believe that this particular reform is going to encourage people that you really consider to be too ignorant to vote. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say to that, I think there should be some safeguards, and if they can provide those safeguards when you walk off the street and walk in and say, I want a ballot, well, I'm not registered, well, sign here. If they can ensure that, but I can visualize organized labor spending all their millions and millions and millions of dollars that no one ever talks about once we have public financing and we now have it of the presidential race. They don't have to spend that money. They can put that into registration and taking people to the polls. They could literally drive busloads of people to the polls and change an election. It just seems to me that at least they ought to make 2 trips. They ought to go first down to register and then back to the polls. What we're doing is saving George Meany a lot of mileage. And if that's the way the system should operate, that may be their view. That's not my view. I think people should vote. I think we ought to make registration accessible, and but I still have some grave reservations about off-street or just walking off the street into a polling place on the very basis that we had registration in the first place to prevent fraud and abuse.
We have to pause for just a second. Well, would you be willing to go so far as to say, I think there ought to be a very simple literacy test that people are required to pass before they vote, because otherwise it's a travesty on the whole democratic process? Or do you think that merely to say that at this stage in American history would strike too many people as offensive?
I think it would strike too many people as offensive.
But it's true, isn't it?
Well, I don't know. I think people can be informed in this electronic era without
knowing how to read or write?
Right. I'm almost as frightened by some who read a lot.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, the graph is rather interesting. The more education you get, the closer you tend to come to the Republican Party, up until you end up
right.
in the ether.
That's right.
Yeah, then you go back.
Yeah. Right. There's a sharp drop. Yeah. But you know, I want people to vote. We went around all over encouraging people to vote, and I think we ought to remove most of the impediments. But I think we look back at some of the races that I can think of, 1960 with Kennedy, Nixon, and a couple of states that were in doubt, Illinois and Texas. Were there shenanigans? Well, was there abuse? We look at some of the states in '76 and the same questions were raised. It just seems to me that we have a right to protect the system where we can. Now, maybe Carter's got some foolproof way to make certain that there's no fraud and no abuse, and it won't be abused by not just the voter, but by some organized group, whether it's organized business or organized labor, who could tilt an election on election day with a great, massive outpouring of money and effort to get people to the polls.
Well, theoretically, why shouldn't people spend a lot of money to get people to the polls, as long as you don't tell them who to vote for?
Well, I don't imagine in a the AFL-CIO will be taking many Republicans to the polls or suggesting anything of that kind. I just get back to the basics. That in itself will not wreck the party. It wouldn't help the Republican Party. And I note that some of the Republican leaders have apparently embraced the Carter program. At least I've read that Bill Brock has, the chairman of the party, and Howard Baker has, the Senate leader, and John Rhodes has. And I think that's a tendency we have when we lose to reach out for anything that might be appealing. And I'm still convinced that we can do it the grassroots way, and at least we ought to try it. We haven't tried it. We've relied on strong personalities in our party, and they have a strong following, and they've done quite well. In the meantime, we've lost one state house after another, and one state legislature after another, and one city after another.
Well, you must have some thesis other than a purely organizational thesis about why we have only, say, 25% of the legislature in Minnesota, 25% of the legislature in Wisconsin. What is it that brought this about? These are states in which there's a fairly high educational level. It's a state in which the traditional pro-democratic inclinations of the black voters during the recent period don't count heavily because there are not many of them. What's going on here? That there's got to be an explanation probably that reaches beyond Watergate and beyond the Civil War and so on.
Well, I think you're probably fairly accurate, though I really believe that had it not been for Watergate, the Republican Party wouldn't have been in a dominant position. I think we're really headed in that direction, the right direction. We're attracting a great many independents and Democrats to the Republican Party. Even in this past campaign, I was surprised at the support among young people for President Ford. There was a great outpouring of support with young voters for President Ford. And I think they tend to want answers to questions and not so much rhetoric. And I think we have an opportunity with the young voters. But I think perhaps we look at it as we should, realistically. We've got to take into account the great force of organized labor. They've had a free rein in this country. They're part and parcel of the Democratic Party with very few exceptions. They have unlimited manpower, unlimited money. They know how to organize. They've done a fantastic job as opposed to business or others who don't follow that view. Now we have teachers who, for the most part, are organized labor, and we're seeing very strong groups on the political scene exerting political pressure counter to Republican principles, and it's taken its toll all across this country. And we've had some leadership problems of our own in the Watergate, and it's hurt us. But I really believe that we're on the threshold of becoming a strong second party, if not a dominant party.
Is there an argument that a reform in the campaign finance laws would have the effect of equalizing the situation that's currently distorted? Would that neutralize, for instance, the advantage of organized labor?
It would if we could change the finance laws. In the most recent...
In which way would you change them?
Well, I would start counting as campaign financing a lot of the so-called soft dollars, the volunteer work, and all the efforts made through their publications. There's a recent publication in just about the last election, which says, as far as it can be determined, organized labor spent about $8.4 million in the Carter campaign. This is above and beyond the 21-some million that he was entitled to spend. This was independent. Communication Workers of America and others through their bulletins and through their leaflets and through their efforts, phone calls. And that's a great force in America. It's organized. They're there. They're in place and they're ready to go. And there are very few Republicans supported by organized labor. Now, what will happen if they are disenchanted with President Carter, as some indicate they are now, because of situs picketing or his efforts or failure to push right-to-work repeal? Maybe there'll be another look. I think there should be another look by organized labor. I think labor leaders ought to take a look at the Republican Party. I happen to believe that, again, that we should appeal to many people in the labor movement, and we did pick up about 38% of the vote among rank-and-file union members.
And do we appeal to them primarily through, for instance, their patriotism, On defense, lack of resistance to inflation.
Inflation, and they're concerned about taxes, concerned about tax reform and crime. I think the liberal programs haven't worked. They've been tried. We've thrown money at programs, and the problems are still there. And if President Carter wants to reorganize the government in a meaningful way, he's going to have a lot of help from Republicans. But how do we as Republicans, what's the forum for the Republican Party? That's our real problem, in addition to organizing. How do the American people know there is a Republican Party? Who speaks for the Republican Party? Jerry Ford, Ronald Reagan, Bill Brock. So we speak with many voices, many of the few we have, and that presents some problems, but I'm still stick to my basis that we've got to go out and go after it. Bill Brock is doing that, and I think that's the right step.
Is it your feeling that the support of organized labor through George Meany made the principal difference in contributing to the loss of McGovern as heavily as he lost in '72?
Well, I think it was a great factor. They made no bones about their dislike for McGovern. And when you turn off that labor spout, you turn off a lot. You turn off, and of course they didn't all follow George Meany's lead, but the great majority of the activists in the labor movement sat on their hands in the McGovern campaign. And when they sit on their hands, you've taken away money and manpower, and you caused McGovern to suffer a rather disastrous defeat. But I think he would have lost in any event. But we spent $40-some million re-electing Nixon when he didn't have a contest. And if that money had been applied in the state and county and congressional races, we'd have picked up some strength in '72. But the group that ran the committee to re-elect the president, they were concerned about one thing, and that's the re-election of Richard Nixon. Mm-hmm. And we had a chance to strengthen our party then, and we didn't take advantage of it.
Is the campaign finance proposals of Mr. Carter also politically oriented, as far as you can see?
Oh, I think so. The public financing designed maybe for proper motives, that all the special interest groups fade away and we're out there running as public bureaucrats with public money. But it does favor the incumbent. There's no way you can take away the advantage an incumbent has. So in addition to the exposure we may have from our local radio and TV stations, now we're going to get a check, in my case, for maybe $500,000 to run for the Senate. And it just seems to me that that's a tremendous advantage for the incumbent. In addition, it again takes away the necessity for organized labor and other special interest groups to raise money for a candidate. And they'll spend all that money out rolling in the voters.
Under the law, would they be permitted to go ahead and raise supplementary money?
Oh yes, I don't know of anything in the law that would preclude that or prohibit that.
So they would presumably have the public subsidy in addition to whatever was raised by the labor union organization, is that right?
Right. I think it's, now some Republicans will support it. In fact, I think some Republicans in the House have joined with some Democrats in supporting public financing.
The incumbents.
The incumbents. Yeah, we're all incumbents. We like it here, and until something better comes along, why not stay here? And that's the attitude that some incumbents have, and the incumbents do lose, as some learned last November.
Some near and dear to us.
Yes, right. Yes.
Mr. William Bray is from American University. He's a graduate student in international communications. Mr. Bray.
Senator Dole, the Republican Party's woes have been blamed on Watergate quite a bit. But would you say that the losses experienced at the state and local government level could be attributed to a lack of communicating an identity, a Republican identity, to the average person? And what it is to be a Republican?
Oh, no doubt about it. And I think this comes from our failure to really focus on the Republican Party and what does the Republican Party do for people, what's the purpose of the Republican Party. We spend most of our time sort of jousting on who's going to be our candidate for president in 1980. That's already started. You know, some may not even be around in 1980, but we're already worried about it. Instead of worrying about electing a governor in New Jersey and re-electing a governor in Virginia and picking up some seats in special elections in Kentucky, you're exactly right. And I think Bill Brock intends to focus on this very thing.
What's the kind of identity you would like to see communicated?
as a responsible party with outstanding candidates working for the American people in the free enterprise system. And there's nothing wrong with the free enterprise system. We hide from it, but so do some businessmen hide from it. They fuss at you if you vote against some program, but when you look for them for help, you couldn't find them in a snowstorm. But we're going to do it. We're going to do it, or Bill Brock is. We're going to help Bill Brock do it. Another one man can't do it. Bill Brock can't do it. But we hope we can help that effort. Find some young, attractive candidates. Say, I want to be a Republican candidate for the state legislature or for some county office. That's how we build a party. That's how the Democrats have stayed in power forever in the South, through strong party organizations.
Ms. Susan Jewell is from George Washington University's PhD candidate for international relations. Ms. Jewell.
Yes, speaking of the incipient demise of the Republican Party, it seems to me that one of the basic premises, maybe I'm wrong, behind the Republican Party is that government should stay out of the private sector and stay out of the lives of the individual citizens as much as possible, to the greatest degree. It seems that there have been profound economic changes over recent, I guess over the past 10, 20, 30 years that have kind of canceled out the need for a Republican Party. The shortage of natural resources and oil, high costs of medical care, even the demands of the people themselves to have a liberalizing trend to accept various ethnic groups, to legislate in favor of these ethnic groups. It seems that there's been even a demand on the part of the people to have the government have more control over the private sector, etc. And it seems that this in itself is canceling out the need for the Republican Party. Do you think that that's true?
Well, I think maybe to some extent, but the pendulum is swinging again. I think it has been in that direction where everybody, not everybody, a great many people demanded more of this and more of that in the federal government. But now we find that they're burdened and overburdened with regulations and too much government. And so we're looking at block grants and other ways to get the government out of their business and out of their backyard and out of some of the problems they have. And I suggest that we don't run from the problems. And that's been another problem we've had. Instead of having some constructive alternative, we've said no. And when it's totally wrong, we should say no. But there comes a time when we ought to say, well, maybe. And maybe we ought to involve the private sector in health insurance. We're going to have it sooner or later. And if we wait for the Democrat solution, it's going to be more and more government into the health insurance field.
You think that that's
I don't know if
negative?
it's passed us by or not. I think we have an opportunity again because there is the feeling in America we have too much government. Carter was probably in part elected because of this, because he ran as an outsider and attacked government programs, duplication, overlapping. So I think there's a lot of pay dirt there for us to work in as a party.
Mr. Gregory Fager is a graduate student in economics at Georgetown's Fager.
Senator, it seems that one of the biggest problems that the Republican Party has experienced in recent years is getting along with themselves. There's a constant emphasis on ideological purity, the conservatives and the liberals. And if the Democrats can reconcile their problems, why can't the Republicans? And
Well,
you'll have to do this, won't you?
I say we must do it if we want to be a strong second party. And I think we fairly well, it was fairly well accomplished after the convention in Kansas City. When you see Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan embracing one another on the platform, that brought together nearly every Republican, because when you bring them all together, they're 18 or 21%. So then you got to go out and find another 29%. But we almost did that. But I agree with that statement. We can't keep dividing ourselves or dividing our strength or dividing our base. We have to find some common ground or some candidate who can appeal to all the wings in our party, and we'll do it. I think Carter may help us.
Don't you think it's more difficult for the Republicans to yield than to the Democrats, since the Republicans tend to be more a party of principle?
Oh, I think so. I think it's...
And therefore to temporize is more difficult for us than for them.
No doubt about it.
I don't say we don't have to do it, but it's more difficult.
But we look at where we are and where they are and what we've done and what they've done, and I don't suggest we change, but we can't be legislative out of existence. I guess we could just fade away, and some might like that, but it seems to me that it's in the interest even of the other party to have a strong second party. And we'll have some help from this administration. It's tougher when you're defending your own administration to build a party in many respects. Every time something happens, it's the administration's fault. By the time you think you have some guy about ready to say, I'm a Republican, something happens in the Secretary of State's office or the President's office or the Secretary of Agriculture, and you've lost him. And we're finding cracks in the Carter strength even now, when they're barely into the administration. Now, we don't build our party based on their failures, but we don't overlook them.
Mr. Bray?
Earlier in the program, you said that you view yourself as a conservative. And I'm curious how you define the word conservative.
Well, I define it from a
to
practical
yourself.
standpoint, having been in the Congress 16 years, as trying to, where I can, to either vote for a program that offers us less government or less spending, but still that will be effective. And but I don't know of any hard and fast rule. I have a lot of people say they were conservatives, and their voting record doesn't back it up. Who makes the measurement?
Is there a philosophical formula to being a conservative? Not
I
just
think
fiscal.
From a practical standpoint, you look at the fiscal responsibility areas, you look at the involvement of government. On the other hand, I'm working with George McGovern on a food stamp program that makes some of my Republican colleagues shudder. But it's nothing new. We've been working on it for years. We think we have a better program. So if you have to mix that into it, well, you sort of fuzz up the philosophy, but I would consider myself somewhere between the moderate and conservative end. But if it goes on a rating basis, I have probably a 0 ADA rating. Now, I don't know where that puts me.
Congratulations.
It could be the American Dairy Association or the American Dental Association, but it happens to be the Americans for Democratic Action. So I guess I'm a right-winger.
Well, in the last
The
presidential
ADAs.
election, do you think the Republican Party overrated a conservative bloc of voters?
Oh, I don't think so. I think we probably we've had the post-election surveys now, and we have a fair idea what happened. But I think we may have overrated possibilities in the South. And we were looking at the conservative vote in the South, but some, even though the conservative, voted for Carter. And so we didn't pick off those 2 or 3 states in Texas that were giving us the election. No, I don't believe so. I think perhaps, I remember in our debate with Mondale, my assignment was to stop defections in the Republican Party. They were running 18%, and they dropped to 6%. Because I think when the debate ended, people knew that I was in a different party than Mondale. Because if you look at only the ratings and nothing else, that was easy to determine. But it's out there. If somebody could put all the conservatives together in America, they're in the majority. But I haven't found anyone yet who could harness that total output,
Ms. Joe?
total potential.
What do you think would be the possibility of the Democratic Party dividing and creating two?
Oh, I'd encourage it, but I don't know.
No, creating two major.
Oh, you mean just have just not have 3 parties, just have 2 Democratic parties? Well,
No, one would probably be more towards a socialist, one farther to the left than the other.
well, that might be hard to work out, but I don't think it will happen in my lifetime. We really believe that we were on this threshold in the early 70s where many Democrats might have left their party to come to the Republican Party. But there really isn't much incentive now to leave the Democratic Party if you're an office holder to come to our party, though some may do it.
What was the reason at that time that there was, were there actually some defections from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party?
There were some defections, some state office holders, some members of Congress. I think they really felt that Nixon was going to sort of put it together for this moderate to conservative new American majority that we talked about in those days. But it all went down the drain with Watergate.
I see, then it would depend more on the individual. This was a question of an individual.
It's pretty hard to provide that leadership when you're not in the White House. So it really makes it more difficult in many ways now unless you get some help from the incumbent president.
Speaking of individuals, do you feel free, Senator Dole, to comment on objectively on whether you think Ronald Reagan might have won the election if he had been nominated in Kansas City?
Well, I don't know. I don't believe he would have, and I just don't. Again, based on election surveys, and when you find good ones, you like them. But it showed that Reagan would not have won the election.
How can they run a survey like that, inasmuch as a full estimate of Reagan could not have been taken until after you'd had the debate?
Right. Well, it's very difficult. I don't think it's probably an accurate survey, but they do indicate that he could not have won. Now, some of Reagan's supporters still feel that had Reagan been on the ticket, he would be in the White House. And that would have been a great alternative. But he wasn't on the ticket, and so and Ford almost stayed in the White House. And the other half that coin is, did some of the Reagan people really exert themselves for President Ford? I found the Reagan people working very hard as I traveled around the country. There's still a feeling that the Reagan people talked about the platform instead of Jerry Ford. And not many people could find platform on the ballot.
Well, you say that you stopped the erosion from 18% to 6%.
Well, I know that I did, but...
well, somebody did. But the 6 were eroding because of what?
Well, I think they may have felt that we weren't firm enough in our conservative...
They were Reaganites, roughly speaking?
I guess so, yes.
And do you think that he could have arrested that erosion further by being more outspoken?
Well, if I could have taken it to 6, he probably could have gone 6 in the other direction. His appeal, but and I'm not certain. I'm not suggesting I took it to 6, but there was a change. That was our assignment in the debate, was to stop defections.
Who's talk propter hoc?
Right.
Mr. Fega.
Senator, you mentioned that organization and attractive candidates are very important for the future of your party. Don't you think that, indeed these are important, but don't you think that broadening your basic viewpoints, if you're really going to get down to the grassroots, are equally as important? That you want to bring in labor unions, but you must have something to offer labor unions, and that the party of Herbert Hoover and Richard Nixon has given you a tremendous amount of bad press.
I don't know what we can offer. I think we can offer a great deal of members of labor unions, but to offer labor unions would be just giving them the whole lock, stock, and barrel. I don't really believe that we could offer enough to capture the support of George Meany or other labor leaders,
No.
unless you say we want to repeal 14B and we're for Citus picketing and
Well, those are some of the things I'm talking about, though. What do you have to offer the labor member? What is it that would attract the labor member to the Republican
I think the
Party?
same thing that attracted 38% in November of '76, and that's a hard stand on defense, the strength of America, crime, taxes. In some areas you get into the busing problem, but for the most part they're taxpayers, they're concerned about inflation, they're concerned about ever-increasing taxes, and that's what we do to attract the rank-and-file working men, to attract leaders. I don't know how we do that, but I wouldn't object to sitting down with them and try to find out.
We have just a minute or two more. Mr. Brady, another question?
I'm assuming by an earlier comment you made that you feel that a name, a personality, is more important than an issue in a presidential election. How would a conservative former vice presidential candidate sum up his treatment by what is called a liberal Eastern press?
You have me in mind?
Yourself, yes.
Well, I don't know. I think you could fuss about press coverage, but it wouldn't do a great deal of good. We're looking at it from the standpoint of seeing where mistakes were made, where we made mistakes. But
was there too much emphasis on the personality over the issue?
We rarely discussed issues. I was labeled a hatchet man before I ever left the box in Kansas City. Never uttered a word, and suddenly I was the hatchet man, and so for the rest of the campaign it was the hatchet man. So I finally got me a hatchet in Alabama and held it up for all the media to see. So I don't know how you overcome the New York Times, or if it's worth it. You know, they were on my back before the ink was dry on the nominating papers. And I guess that's a right they have, but it seems to me that since they never talked to me once during the campaign, the editorial writers, that they took a great deal of liberty. But that's
Well, they lost their election at the same time. That makes it feel better.
Yeah, right. Well, I don't, I think overall it wasn't bad, but I didn't have the right philosophy for the people who covered our campaign. But I think they were fairly objective.
Do you think, Senator, as a final question, do you think that some of these political commentators are correct in saying that the reason Ford, as a Republican, was able to do so well is that Americans tend increasingly to suspend formal ideological affiliations and simply view the election as a media event and are attracted respectively to this man or the other man? In other words, in running for president, you're never going to be as encumbered in running for political office as you would running for senator or for governor. Is that plausible to you?
Well, it may be, but I really believe that in the final analysis, Ford nearly won the election because a great many Americans had confidence, and they knew he was predictable. They knew what President Ford would do if he were reelected.
He'd liberate Poland.
Well, if we'd never heard of Eastern Europe, that might have helped too. But the point was that Jerry Ford was predictable. You were comfortable with Jerry Ford, and I think even the president may have felt that the undecided voter is going to vote to keep the president in office. Well, 6 out of 10 voted for a change, and so we have it. And whether we've been shortchanged or not remains to be seen.
But on the whole, would you say that his exposure on television helped him or hurt him, Mr. Ford?
I think it helped him.
Precisely because he was reassuring?
Reassuring. I think perhaps he was able to underscore the basic points about a limited government, about the positive aspect of his vetoes, about a strong defense. Now, he did sort of had a rose garden strategy, and when he was in the rose garden, we were in the briar patch, and that's where we found ourselves most of the campaign.
Thank you very much, Senator Dole. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the panel, and thank you, students from American University.
Those who are still awake, yes.
For a printed, bound transcript of this program, send $1 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina, 29250. That's Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina, 29250. This program was produced by SECA, which is solely responsible for its content, and was funded in part by public television stations.